Hello, you. You're listening to A History of Italy. Episode 186. Julius II changes his mind, and some spanking.
E così ritorno su, lascio I colli nelle valli, tra due salici piangenti, io ritrovo la speranza di un amore che ormai fu.
So Venice had taken a pretty bad beating and lost almost all of the lands they controlled on the Italian mainland, which had fallen almost exclusively into the hands of the French, except for some areas such as Gorizia, Trieste, Udine, and Cividale, which fell to the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, and some of the coastal areas in Puglia, which went to the Spanish. Given a choice, cities generally preferred submission to the more distant and weaker emperor than the French in the north. At this point, the French insisted for the final push to enter the lagoon and put an end to the independence of the most serene republic. Pope Julius II was not too keen on the idea. Would a Venice under the control of the French be as effective at fighting off the main enemy, whom theoretically all of Christendom should band together against, not the Judean People's Front, but the Turks? What's more, would the French be content with just having control of northern Italy? Would they want to encroach the lands of the Papal States? Also, how much influence was the Pope going to have in the French lands? Already the king was making requests to have rights over religious benefits and the investiture of bishops, and we know how much the whole investiture business can become quite problematic. The Pope was having second thoughts, and would soon have a very radical change of heart. Meanwhile in Venice, they were reeling from the defeat at Agnadello. As was the custom, the doge or the oligarchy were not blamed, but the commanders on the battlefield. The main commander, however, Bartolomeo d'Alviano, could not be tried as he was in French custody. Many saw the defeat as a consequence of the expansion into the mainland, something historically un-Venetian and perceived as corrupting, with the desire to hold lands and live on luxurious country estates and have lucrative political offices. The Patriarch of Venice, Antonio Contarini, thundered against the corruption he felt Venice had fallen into and ordered a republic-wide fast as penitence. The fact that we called Contarini Patriarch reminds us of the unusual relationship that Venice had with religion, in the sense that they often did their own thing and nominated their own bishops, with the Patriarch himself acting as a sort of substitute pope. This was one thing that Julius wanted to change, and for a time the Venetians would allow him to think he had. After a long silence following the disastrous defeat of Agnadello, the doge Lorenzo Loredan finally spoke to the council. He spoke defiantly of a Venetian comeback, pointing to the fact that Vicenza still held out for Venice, and although Padua and Brescia had fallen, they had already started to rebel against the French. Plus, the Venetian army was actually still intact. The doge invited all the notable men of the Republic to pay up their taxes, and the session would end with cries of "Guerra! Guerra! War! War!" Padua was retaken, thanks to trickery, but that's beside the point. Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian moved to besiege Padua, but moved too late, allowing the Venetians to shore up the defences. After a few weeks of useless bombardment and sloshing around in the mud, the siege was lifted and Maximilian headed home in shame, with the added salt in the wounds, with the farmers along the hilltops as he returned north pulling down their pants and mooning him. Shortly after that, an ally of the Pope, Francesco Gonzaga, was captured by a bunch of peasants as he lay at rest and was handed over to Venice. With every success, more cities returned to Venice, already tired of putting up with having to feed and support French troops. With every Venetian success, although he was already having second thoughts, the Pope fell into deeper and deeper rages, throwing things, smashing others, and going into almost apoplectic fits, which included bouts of blasphemy. As 1509 seemed to be closing in Venice's favour, a Venetian admiral, Angelo Trevisan, made a move against another French ally, the Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso d'Este, husband of Lucrezia Borgia. Trevisan attempted a river attack on Ferrara in an area known as Polesine, but the Venetian galleys were far too easy target for Duke Alfonso d'Este's favourite toys, his artillery. A later engagement with the forces of the League of Cambrai at Polisella marked the end of the positive comeback run of the most serene republic. The return of the forces of Cambrai would later be marked by atrocities, such as in May 1510 at the massacre of the caves of Vicenza. The citizens of that city, having grown tired of the persecution from the German troops, under their commander, Rudolf IV, Prince of Anhalt, decided to escape to the countryside, seeking safety in the nearby caves of Costozza and Mossano. Men, women, and children sought refuge there. The soldiers followed them in the hopes of managing to loot the possessions they were carrying, and once the people were in the caves, they piled brush and wood at the entrance and set fire to it. As the smoke started to billow into the caves, the refugees started to cough and splutter. The choice now was to stay inside and choke to death, or run out and face the encircling soldiers. Only a single farmer opted for the latter, running out with his hoe to die fighting. It is estimated that between 1,000 and up to 2,000 civilians had entered the caves. One survived, a little girl who managed to find a crevice just wide enough to suck air through that allowed her to survive. Once again, the Italian habit of calling the foreign troops barbarians seemed justified. But before that dark day came, something else would come into play that would turn the whole situation upside down. Already having second thoughts, as we mentioned, the failed Venetian attack on Ferrara actually went in the direction of appeasing the Pope, since the Duke of Ferrara was on Julius's hit list. The diplomatic wheels got rolling, and hey presto, on the 24th of February, 1510, Julius II found himself sitting on his throne, surrounded by 12 cardinals, facing some very penitent-looking Venetian ambassadors. After some scolding and grovelling, a deal was made, and the Pope and the Serenissima were friends again. The ceremony then ended with a bit of symbolic violence, with the cardinals actually whipping the poor ambassadors. Now, I am in no way promoting the use of violence in diplomacy, but I would be rather curious, for example, to see the Canadian and Mexican government authorities summoning the US ambassadors to their country to give them a stern talking to, topped off by a vigorous spanking. I'm just saying it would be interesting. Unknown to Julius, who would have blown a gasket, the organization that had come to prominence in the government of Venice, the Council of Ten, voted 13-2 to create a parallel secret document to the agreement with the Pope. Yes, no need to start counting. I did say the Council of Ten voted 13-2, which adds up to 15, but they were called the Council of Ten, but they were actually now 15. The secret document basically said that everything that the Venetian ambassadors had agreed to had been extorted under duress and was not to be considered valid in any way and on any point. With this sorted, Venice did give back to the Pope the lands, particularly in Romagna, that he claimed. One of the reasons that Julius, apart from being known as having had St. Peter's built by Bramante and then a slew of other architects that would eventually also include Michelangelo, is also considered one of the architects of the Papal States, is that rather than assigning the lands to a nephew or illegitimate son to carve out a duchy, he left the cities under the direct control of the Church, with the papal representative overseeing a wide variety of forms of government, according to each local reality, to try and maintain a balance. That meant that in some cases the signori were allowed back if the local oligarchies were happy with them, and in other cases the cities were ruled directly by the Church. We've already spent a bit too much time mentioning toing and froing of cities that you, and probably I, won't remember, so let's accelerate things a little bit. Now, with the same vigour which he had fought against Venice, Julius turned against France. He had a little trouble getting everyone on board, also because they were taken by surprise and were still in an alliance with France. But he eventually, in 1512, managed to form the Holy League, which was a name given to alliances that included the papacy. This one included Spain, Venice, the Swiss, and the English under Henry VIII, who could and would happily open a second front against the French. This alliance would eventually kick the French completely out of Italy, putting the Duchy of Milan under the control of the Spanish, who would then control the north and south of Italy. This is a pretty sweeping summary, and we have to mention that the French didn't just give up without a fight. Two notable French victories were the retaking of Bologna, which happened before the new league was actually formed. On this occasion, the French, who had brought the Bentivoglio back to power, took the bronze statue that Pope Julius had Michelangelo make for him and melted it down to make a cannon which was mockingly called with the female version of the Pope's name, calling it La Giulia. The other notable French victory was one of the bloodiest battles of the age on Italian soil, the Battle of Ravenna. In this battle, the French lost their star commander, Gaston de Foix, and the victory was not enough to hold on to Italy. In February of 1512, the victors of the Holy League met in Mantua. Things were rather messy from the start with different contrasting interests. Venice, for example, was not at all included, which would eventually push them to another alliance which would see them end up allied with the French. The Pope, on his part, couldn't find allies against Ferrara, a big bee in his bonnet. In the end, Julius II seemed to think that a very good way out of the impasse was to die, which he did in the night between the 20th and 21st of February, 1512. The warrior Pope had fought his last battle. Speaking of which, during the fight against the French, he had once again actually gone into battle, at one point actually scaling the walls during the siege of Mirandola. Two things did come out of the conference in Mantua that are interesting for our story. One was that a Sforza, Massimiliano, son of Ludovico, was allowed back into Milan. The other was that a certain family we know well was about to be allowed back into Florence. The Medici were coming back to town. Thank you very much for listening. A History of Italy is a Sentire Media podcast, produced and hosted by me, Mike Corradi, and produced by my wonderful Patreon supporters, whom I would like to thank, starting with the second half of the Margherita Hack and Galileo Galilei level: Jeffrey W., John M., John J., Jordan C., Joshua G., Julia G., Justin E., Kyle D., Old John in Milwaukee, Linus, Mark P., Michus Porcius, Moppet King, Paradise, Patrizia K., Rocco B., Rod L., Russell F., Sandra P., Scott L., Sean M., Shelby, Shelley, Simon O., Stephen, and Tap Dance Down Under. And of course, we cannot forget the tippy top Maria Montessori and Dante Righieri level: Lisa K., Peter W., David L., David C., Sen, David A., Karen D., Helenka, Bridget, Dallas Robinson, Joseph V., Stephen G., and Julian. If, like them, you'd like to have access to ad-free episodes and extra content, you can do so by going to ahistoryofitaly.com to the support page and becoming a Patreon supporter, or just supporting us on PayPal. We thank you very much for your support. If you just want to get in touch, we'll be more than happy to hear from you. hello@ahistoryofitaly.com, or on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and until next time, arrivederci.